To go back to Daniel's remarks about the suppressed history of Wales, I thought it was really so instructive to be reminded that that within the larger island of Great Britain, there are these internal colonies that some of these colonies are studied in more detail in relationship to other external colonies, overseas colonies, as I might call them, Ireland and India. There's a very vast scholarship about the affinities between Ireland and India. But I take to heart what Zara and Katie had written up in their prospectus for this session about the relative invisibility of Wales and India in, more broadly speaking, in the scholarship. And there are far more of you in this forum who are knowledgeable about these connections and about Welsh history than I possibly could be. So all I can do is only offer my very humble thoughts about how we could begin talking about these elisions, these omissions, and perhaps even more importantly, why these omissions continue to persist. And perhaps a starting point for that would be the seminal work of Raymond Williams. One of the reasons I would have loved to attend in person is to consult the papers, which Daniel just mentioned a few moments ago. Raymond Williams, his work has been so profoundly important on my generation of scholars. My mentor, Edward Said, was almost, I think, a devotee of Raymond Williams. And I think from the time that I had been a graduate student, the work of Raymond Williams just suffused my environment. So it always struck me as perhaps, a point worth reflecting on. Why, a critic who had written so perspicaciously about culture and society somehow did not extend the, amazing insights he had into the nexus between culture and society, into the field of culture and imperialism. I would like to start off by noting Williams's profound reflections on Welsh culture and its colonization by the English metropole. His essays, some of them brief, some of them more extended, are really quite remarkable in the way that he keeps coming back to the sense of being an internal colony. There is this remarkable line in his essay, Welsh Culture, very simply put, is called Welsh Culture, where he writes, "We have been defeated, colonized, penetrated, incorporated." And, the language of colonization that he very explicitly uses to describe being Welsh gives rise to the expectation that he might have identified Wales with England's overseas colonies. He talks at length about linguistic imperialism, about the experience of being in school and being told that Welsh not, he had this phrase, Welsh not, which were marked almost like, Post-its all over the school saying Welsh not. So he talks about linguistic imperialism, and I'm sure Dr. Roberts later on will be speaking much more about educational policy. But, reading these descriptions of Welsh, the Welsh experience of having the language suppressed, of having the culture suppressed, of feeling the sense of difference from metropolitan England, might make one think that, Williams would have extended that sense of being colonized to, greater elaboration of the experience of colonialism elsewhere in the, what I would like to continue to use as the phrase overseas colonies, as distinct from the internal colonies. But that association does not materialize in the ways that one might expect. For its cultural analysis is continuous with a critical approach characteristic of the British left at the time, which exclusively studied the formation of metropolitan culture from within its own boundaries. Now, I have been writing about this elsewhere, and I'm not going to talk too much about, or rehearse that argument elsewhere, but what I have marked on before is Williams's silence about imperialism, his failure to account for imperialism's shaping hand in English culture. And I've also argued that this is less a theoretical oversight or blindness. Williams is too astute, too fine a critic to simply have this major blind spot. But what I've also noted that it's an internal restraint that has complex methodological and historical origins. I suggest that Williams's methodological difficulties can be traced to his conflicting models of interpretation. In the first instance, Williams viewed culture as process and as an internal social development of English life. But in the second instance, he reversed that understanding of culture and analyzed imperialism as a full-blown enactment of economic motives that are encompassed by a larger system of economic determination. And so, the critic who wrote so insightfully about culture and society set culture and imperialism in mutual opposition, torn between the fluidity and undecidability of social process on the one hand, and on the other hand, the implacable operation of a system of economic forces. So the questions I would like to ask are, does such ambiguity mean that his cultural theory is flawed to begin with? Are the intellectual paradigms for discussing imperialism simply unavailable to him? Can Williams offer an effective alternative to studying culture and empire as mutually exclusive so that Wales can be considered alongside India and the other overseas British colonies? So that, the question that I think came up in the quotes that Daniel had from Amir Mufti of the internal colonies of the other within. Amir, by the way, happens to be a former student of mine at Columbia. So this question about the other within is, I think, is very important in the sense that, can the other bit within be identified as facing a similar history as the other outside? And I think in many ways, Williams points the direction, it points the weight in that direction, particularly in a work like The Country, when he talks about the city and the country. At one point he writes, and I quote, "The model of the city and country in economic and political relations has gone beyond the boundaries of the nation state. What was happening in the city, the metropolitan economy, determined and was determined by what was made to happen in the country. First, the local hinterland, and then the vast regions beyond it in other people's lands." So, the fact that he would locate the, what's happening in the city as having its origins in the country and then extending outward to other people's lands seems to suggest that he's developing this model for looking at the tension between city and country as possibly offering analogs to the tensions between metropole and colony. And yet, as Williams is quick to point out, colony does not function merely as an analogous term to country. He takes great care to stress that the relation of the metropolis to the country, on the one hand, and its relations to the countries, to the colonies, cannot be understood as interchangeable. Quite the contrary, he emphasizes that colonial developments had a more direct an immediate effect on the ascendancy of the metropole, contributing in the long run to the eventual decline of England's rural base. In other words, I think this is what I found quite interesting, that instead of seeing the country and the rural base, or the rural base and the colony as sharing similar situations, similar conditions, Williams seems to suggest that the cultivation of the colonies and the consolidation of the colonies had this negative effect on the country, and that in the long run, the development of the colonies ended up diminishing the rural base. As an instance, he cites the profits that were generated by the new rural economy of the tropical plantations and the whole organized colonial system of which it was a part, successfully transforming Britain into an industrial and urban society. He insists that the decline of England's rural areas cannot be separated from these developments in the colonies. That decline, he notes, was further hastened by newly created problems of poverty and overcrowded cities, in partial solution to which the colonies acquired new significance as places of emigration. So what I find interesting, and this is something that I've been thinking a bit more about since the occasion for the seminar was being proposed, that far from seeing the internal colony and the external colony as having a shared history, in some ways it would seem, through the economic analysis that Williams is producing in this work, that he sees the internal colony and the external colony as in some ways being in competition with each other, and that the external colony and the profits that are being generated through the the tropical plantations, as an example, outside, that is creating a corresponding decline in England's rural base, so that there is this kind of asynchrony that's developing between the internal and the external, and that's something that perhaps we can talk about a little bit later. I'm not really sure how much time I have. I may not have time to flesh out the argument that I was hoping to make, but that's not so important so much as perhaps having a robust discussion. But maybe what I can say is, since I mentioned emigration in the last few moments, there's also that sense in which, the idea that, okay, 3 minutes left. The idea that, the colonies become the place for emigrating to as, poverty increases in the countryside, and there's this glut on the city, and that emigration is a reality in the time that Williams is writing. And yet, at the same time, the colonies do not exist in, as a visible presence in Williams's work. And though he writes with remarkable clarity and astuteness about the conditions of rural decline and of urban overcrowding, there is, and particularly in the novels that he analyzes, the 19th century novels, I mean, I have found it very interesting that when he writes about the progression of his characters who can no longer find a place within their society because of depressed economic circumstances, there is a kind of code that he uses where he says the characters were put on a boat. And that put on a boat becomes a way in which he describes that the empire becomes the solution for the, for the increasing plight, economic plight within the countryside. And that the effect of this putting his characters on the boat, the effect is to render colonies without material presence or substance, so that the colonies as actual places impinging on the lives of English characters cannot be accommodated by Williams's location of dramatic conflict in the economic plight of the characters within within the countryside, within the cities, and the way that that plight is interpreted in terms of their own, psychological problems, dramatic situations, so that the colonies in this reading are turned into a vanishing point, the symbolic space for dissolving all problems that cannot be solved at home. So that there's a curious and disturbing presentation of the lands that characters emigrate to as empty spaces to be newly populated and settled. And then the last point that I want to make, what I found particularly astounding is that when he writes about Wales, this is one of the things that he plaintively remarks on, that that in the representation of Wales in metropolitan English writing, he first of all writes about Wales as having been reduced to a site of tourism, that Wales's landscape exists as England's past, as a site of tourism. And when I mentioned empty spaces, the colonies as empty spaces, when he writes about Wales, he says that very pointedly, he says that in English writings and metropolitan English writings, Wales is not even seen, and Wales simply becomes only a site for the Englishman's wilderness. That Wales is reduced to wilderness, just in the way that the colonies are reduced to these empty spaces, to these places that have been cleared out. And as he says at one point, the colony was waiting for laborers. That's a sentence that I think he uses maybe in the Long Revolution, that the colony is waiting for laborers. So it's this, kind of dissynchronous situation that I wanted to end with, to say that when he remarks with such acuity that Wales has been reduced to a site of the metropolitan English person's wilderness. It's also the point where he stops when he talks about the colony. The wilderness, the colony remains a wilderness for Williams in his own critical writings. And this is the problem that perhaps we can explore in the discussion. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. Thank you.